Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States with the Executive Director of the Virtual Center, Dr. Bill O'Brien. Now, today's session. Here's Dr. Bill.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. On a Tuesday afternoon, we are into the middle of March. It is the 14th day, March. Oh my God, I'm running way behind. I'll tell you. I knew it began with an M. That's all I remember. It is the 14th day of May, and we welcome you to our program today. I've been playing around with a number of different places we might go today, and we'll probably touch on all of them at one point or another. But before I do that, I want to first, and I hope I have adequately welcomed you to today's program, and part of that welcome is to invite you to participate actively in the program by sharing your ideas. One of the suggestions that kind of emerged today, it wasn't suggested, well, I was talking to somebody else about the issue of calls, and in the course of the discussion, this occurred to me. It wasn't suggested to me directly, but I think that it probably warrants, some serious consideration. And one of the issues I had was we were talking about the lack of callers. We had, if you remember, one day a couple of weeks ago, we had a couple of calls on the line, and we were operating with a substitute or a fill-in computer, and we didn't have the capability of getting the callers on the air. So basically what I learned afterwards was that listeners could hear the callers and they could hear me, but I couldn't hear the listeners and they couldn't hear me. So that was really an issue. But I think we've got that resolved. But again, it's the issue of, in the middle of a story, it's hard to interrupt, and some people don't want to do that. And I understand that because I was never one of the more forward students in class ever. I was always one of the ones that my first consideration always was, before I asked a question, well, I've got a question, but on the other hand, it's probably going to sound awfully stupid. Maybe if I wait, somebody else will ask it. And consequently, most of the time, it never gets asked. And I understand perfectly, because I've been there, what the concerns are of people. And one of the things I thought was that, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to feel like you're interrupting. But if I can, because you're not, but if I can break the program into segments a little bit more directly, more consciously, and basically complete a point of view and say, now this is a good time if you have a question or a suggestion, or you'd like me to explain something further or whatever before we move on, this would be a good point to raise it on that particular issue. And try to almost build in an invitation for questions and comments within the program itself. Problem is, I have to remember to do this. And, if you've listened to any number of programs already, you know that I kind of fly off into the stratosphere a lot of times. And I really lose connection with the fact of where I am and what I'm doing. I'm just talking about stuff I find really interesting, and it kind of takes me to the next level, so to speak. And sometimes that's not fair for you because you don't know how to access that. And I perfectly understand that, and I want you to know that. I will never criticize anybody for calling. You are never interfering, and there's no way in the world that your question would appear to sound unintelligent or stupid, because basically all of these things are merely interpretations or speculations. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but because there are some people that interpret history and basically lay it down as the law of the land, and the fact that it's not their interpretation, but it's fact because it is their interpretation, and we're talking about very doctrinaire, demagogic type of people who basically, if their little brains come upon something, they feel that it must be the absolute truth, and they must be the first people in the history of mankind to encounter it. And so therefore they want to basically share it with the world, and the way they do that is they label it with truth and they shout really loud, and they won't let anybody raise questions or about it or question it or anything else. I think we live in a society, as you know, where we see a lot more of that than I think it would be, than it's helpful for us. We'd be a lot healthier if we had a little bit more dialogue and a little bit less demagoguery. But be that as it may, I want you to know that you are welcome to participate in this program at any time. And the phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's area code 304-658-3333. And if you'd like to email me directly, and a number of folks have, then by all means, first of all, I welcome it. I appreciate the time that goes into putting an email together. Some of them have been extensive, and I appreciate that so much, because all of it speaks to, first of all, I think the mere fact that you do that, indicates or suggests an element of trust, which I know is there, but I'm glad that you feel that it's there as well. And the second thing is that I will make every effort in the world to answer you just as quickly as I can. I would like, as you do email, to put your thoughts and ideas together with the idea that if I can find a way to incorporate them into the program without revealing you, I will do that. Because if you're willing to reveal you, then for Lord, pick up the phone and call us, and let's just talk about it. But if you email me on a one-to-one basis, then I don't feel comfortable identifying you in public unless you express an interest or willingness to have that done. So, but I will include the idea or the concept or the theme of your email, especially if it seems to fit in so comfortably with what we've been doing on the air. And chances are, by definition, most emails are, because they're precipitated by what we do on the air. So chances are they'll be relevant and worthy of at least being shared with other people if the opportunity to engage you in discussion about your ideas it's not there directly. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And again, the phone number, area code 304-658-3333. In thinking about a program today, one of the things that we have not really done is to spend a little bit of time just looking at the Constitution. And, of course, one way to look at it is to read it. How many times have teachers assigned students the responsibility of reading the Constitution of the United States? How many times have students actually done it, I wonder? Have you ever read the Constitution of the United States from one end to the other? It's pretty laborious. It's pretty tough. It's written by attorneys for attorneys. It's written at a level and in a language that's really difficult to understand. That's not by accident, obviously. I don't think anybody in their right mind would believe that the purpose of the Constitution was to write down the overall governing procedure system under which we all agree to be governed, and to do it in a way which everybody can clearly understand it and its ramifications. It seems to me that that's never been argued by anybody. So one of the things I thought I would do is just kind of go through and say, this is what Article 1's about, this is what Article 2's about. But then what I thought I particularly would do, and this would be a little bit later in the program, is identify those elements of the Constitution which have or seem frequently to attract which seem frequently to attract the most attention. And what I'd like to do, very honestly, is move from the Constitution into interpretations of the Constitution, and specifically look at a few of the major Supreme Court decisions, especially under the tutelage of Chief Justice John Marshall, who was Chief Justice from 1803 up until he died in 1835. And because so much of the Constitution that we know today is the product of interpretations by the Marshall Court. And so there's no question that a focus on John Marshall, it's, you know, some people it really bothers that so much attention to the early history of the court is devoted to John Marshall, but it's hard to do that. And one of just a piece of information which I think is significant. I was blown away by these numbers myself, but this is really interesting. John Marshall was involved while he was on the court. John Marshall was involved in 1,127 different decisions. 1,127. He was in the minority only 7 times. 7 times out of 1,127 opportunities. That pretty well suggests that John Marshall, during the period that he was Chief Justice, was the court. He pretty well spoke for the majority most of the time. In most of the major decisions, John Marshall wrote the decision, and the agreement on it was pretty solid, pretty unanimous. Occasionally there were split decisions, 5-4 decisions. Rarely did that happen when Marshall was in the minority. But I think that's incredible number. Only 7 times was he in the minority. What that meant was that out of 1,127 times he was in the minority, he lost, his side lost, or his position lost only 7 times. So that pretty well suggests that to give him the kind of attention that he gets and to basically refer to the Marshall Court as a particular court with a particular point of view is not really out of place at all. It seems to me to be very, very appropriate for the kind of power that this guy wielded. So what I thought I would do is, at the beginning of today's program is just kind of look at the Constitution, look at some of the key parts of it, just so people get an idea as to how you can get your arms around this document. If you try to read it, and if you read it without really understanding the overall structure of it, it becomes even more intimidating than it is if you kind of understand it. So before I, with that, let me open. I'm looking. It's almost every American history textbook that you pick up has a copy of the Constitution at the end, in the appendix. And so I picked one off my shelf just before we went on the air. Actually, the book that I'm using, not that it matters, because the Constitution is the Constitution, no matter where it's reprinted. But the book I have in my hands is Pauline Meyer's book on ratification, which was published in October of 2010. And I have this in my hands frequently because it goes through state after state on the ratification of the Constitution. So I think it's one heck of a book. And so I've opened it to the appendix, where there is a copy of the Constitution of the United States. And I thought I'd just basically and it's only going to take a moment. I'm not going to go into a lot of details. The alternative would be to read the Constitution on the air, and I'm surely not going to do that. That would be cruel and unusual punishment. I don't know where that is in the Constitution, but somewhere in there, one of the amendments. Anyway, of course, the Constitution opens with a short paragraph. It's 5 lines, which is called the preamble. Many people know what the preamble to the Constitution is. Many people have, I know I was, when I was in school, had to memorize it. We had to memorize it as well. And the purpose of the preamble is to basically spell out the purpose of the Constitution, what the intent of the document is about, what it was designed to do. And it's going to be familiar to everybody, and there's just a comment or two that I would make on it. But let's kind of focus on the preamble for a second. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. So if you look at the preamble, there are 6 specific purposes for which the Constitution is being established. The first one is in order to form a more perfect union. Basically, to put that into our own terms, to form a more perfect union suggests that the one that exists is not perfect, if this one's going to be more perfect. And so obviously this is a replacement for the Articles of Confederation, which we know James Madison believed was not perfect by any stretch. In fact, he had a whole document called The Vices of the American Political System, which indicated ways in which the Articles of Confederation was not perfect. So this one's going to be more perfect. This is going to be a more perfect union as a result of this document. The other thing, of course, is the opening words of the constitutional preamble itself. We, the people of the United States. Notice, it is not we, the people of the states of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia and Delaware. It's not that. It is, so in other words, the founders, the framers of the Constitution, in the Constitution, are speaking for all the people in the name of all the people of the United States. Now, the reason that's significant, we've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again, is because if the government and the Constitution represents all the people of the United States, in other words, if the people of the United States, to go back to the Declaration of Independence, gave their consent to be governed under this document, the consent of the governed in Jefferson's Declaration, then philosophically what the founders have done, what the framers of the Constitution have done, is go back to the origins of legitimate power as far as Western philosophy defined it, which was the will of the people. And going back to all of those documents about the will of the people, it is the people, according to John Locke, going back to him specifically, it is the people who made the decision to leave the state of nature and to form what we usually refer to as the social contract, to create a society. And in the name of that society, to introduce a government whose powers would derive from the consent of the governed. So in a sense, by going back, by opening the Constitution with the words, "We the people of the United States," what is indicated here is that this document is being ratified by the people, which means it takes supremacy over any document that existed before, because if the people created the earlier ones, then the people have a right to create a new one, and that's what this is. So in a sense, it negates whatever consent of the governed existed previously. And I think that's very significant. You know, Lincoln's going to use this when he, you know, during the controversy over the right of the southern states to secede from the Union. They're going to argue that the Union is a compact, a league of friendship, and that as independent states they entered it, and as independent states they can withdraw from it. The Articles of Confederation was that, but this document is not. And the evidence of it is at the very, very beginning of the Constitution, because this document is written in the name of the people of the United States. The only way that it can be changed or that people can withdraw from it is with the blessing of the people of the United States, not the blessing of the state of South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, or any other specific state. The people of the United States. And that was the position that Lincoln took from the very beginning, and he never veered from it. This was a rebellion because individual states were violating the will of the people as expressed in the Constitution of the United States. And Lincoln believed that as President of the United States, he represented all the people, and any effort to destroy or break up the Union was treason. It was rebellion. It wasn't leaving a compact. That compact was negated by this one. And so I think that's significant. So again, the first purpose of the Constitution is to create a more perfect union. The second one is to establish justice. Now, of course, the whole idea of establishing justice is an interesting one. We could play around with that for a while. Does that imply that justice did not exist prior to the Constitution? If that's true, then that means that those specific aspects of justice that we experience under the Constitution come from it, not from the Creator, not from the state of nature, not from John Locke, not from God. These are not inalienable rights. They are civil rights. They are rights specifically generated by this particular constitution, this particular political system. So therefore, justice as it will be defined in this society is going to be defined within this document. And the courts are going to be expected to respond appropriately to those specific definitions. Ensure domestic tranquility is creating a government with the ability to control its own internal affairs, to put down rebellions. And we know that in the Confederation period, and I'm thinking specifically of Shays' Rebellion, but there were many more, the argument that many of the supporters of the Constitution made in response to Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in September of 1786 was that under the Confederation there was not a government with the power to prevent such internal rebellions as this. What was to prevent other rebellions from breaking out in other places, for example? I'm struck, this is just an aside, and you can kind of, write this off as a, going off on a tangent, maybe. But I remember when I first went to graduate school, one of the most, Merrill Jensen was the professor of our seminar, and one of the things that I remember so clearly is when we were choosing research topics for what would ultimately become our master's thesis, and for most of us, what would become after that our PhD thesis. And so in a sense, the selection of the topic was critical, although I don't think, I didn't appreciate that. I didn't appreciate that I was going to be living with this the rest of my life when I picked it. But anyway, the point is that one of the things that we were asked to do, that Professor Jensen asked us all to do, was to enroll as part of our graduate course of studies toward the PhD, to enroll in a 2-semester history course taught by Stanley Cutler, who was a constitutional history professor there, on the history of the Constitution of the United States. And I was privileged to do that, and I am privileged to call Stanley Cutler one of the people who most profoundly influenced my life, my professional life, and just one of the world's all-around good people. And Stanley was in 2 times during our PRISM grant, and he's the author of several books. One of them I'm going to get to, if not today, then in our next program. He also edited a wonderful collection of primary source materials related to the Supreme Court of the United States. It's a wonderful supplementary reader for an upper level or a graduate constitutional history course, which I just developed and taught 2 semesters ago, by the way. And Dr. Cutler, Stanley Cutler, is one of my good friends and colleagues, and he. Many people know Dr. Cutler Stanley because he was the one that initiated the case that ultimately is responsible for making the Watergate tapes available to the public. He's the one that went to court and put the case together that the attorneys rendered to the Supreme Court when they told the Nixon White House that they would have to release the Watergate tapes. And so much of what happened as a result of Watergate and the ultimate resignation of President Nixon was directly attributable to the work and the efforts of Stanley Cutler. And I just kind of wanted to mention that.
Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob.
Hate to interrupt, but you've got a caller on the line.
Okay, please.
Jeff is with us, calling from New York.
Jeff, thank you. Thank you for calling. How are you?
I'm busting my chops and nobody cares. I'm only kidding. I'm too old to do that. I've been listening to you for probably 4 months now. We were in Florida. I sort of picked you up on one of the stations. I was just surfing the internet, and I heard you speaking. And I've been working with a whole bunch of guys, professors in economics and in the monetary and the economic thing. So I've been forced into looking at Locke and Smith and Mrs. and anyway, I just first of all want to compliment you. The work you've done is absolutely fantastic. It's caught my imagination. It's the best I've ever seen, and it should be. You should get all your stuff as broad as possible because your work is great. That's my compliment to you. I want to make sure you got that. So one thing.
At the state of that, thank you. I appreciate that so much.
And we work with a lot of colleges, and we work with other radio programs. I try not to do left or right stuff, but we try to talk about how do we bring humanity forward, and that's why I got involved with the economic system. But I must say, when you talk about Locke and Smith, Locke had me convinced in the very beginning of some of the work he did that, human labor is great, and we have to respect property. And then the next, I'm not paraphrasing this. I don't remember exactly how you put it, but like about maybe one paragraph, you said, money is like gold, and gold is forever, and therefore gold and money trumps all property ownership. Uh-huh. And that was, I can't tell you exactly that, but you know the part I'm talking about?
I know exactly where you are, and I can't quote it either.
Yeah, but once he said that, he blew the entire treatise. It was gone. And in one paragraph, he just wipes it out. And then I think, what's his name? Adam Smith comes in maybe, a year later or so. I forget how far. It doesn't matter. And he says, in the invisible hand of the market or the invisible hand of God. And now he cements the whole damn thing with, it's all a belief system. So the entire problem we're running into has nothing to do with the monetary system or gold or silver. It's the belief system and the economy. And that goes so far back. We traced it back at least 6,000 years. But now we could change it. We can fix most of the problems, not all of the problems, but most of the problems. And I'd love you to go, if you can, I don't know if you've actually gone back that as a professional that far back to find out, where this belief economic system, if it's a religious system, which it's like, I could opt out of religion, but I can't opt out on a worldwide economic system. That's our problem.
No, I agree. And no, I haven't gone back that far. In fact, you're probably much more well-spoken on that than I am. I agree with you. A lot of people focus on Locke. One of the things that I found about Locke and his emphasis on money is that in a sense, the thing that I focused on, I don't know whether this helps or not, but one of the things I found really positive about Locke is that he was very aware that once people began to assign a monetary value to property, once it became a commodity with monetary value, that in itself instigated the desire to accumulate more of it than people needed. Up to that point, you could make the case, and it sounded very reasonable, that everybody ought to have access to private property, and everybody had a right to as much of God's world, of the Creator's world, as they needed. And it was not an issue, but once you put a monetary value on it, then there was a reason to try to accumulate more than anybody needed. And his argument was, from that point, the whole thing went haywire. And I agree with him.
I agree. I agree fully. The problem is like we have the Occupy groups all over the world now, and they're all screaming, it's unfair, it's unfair. Well, it's not unfair in the way our monetary system is working now, our economic system is working now. But if we had a number on it, which we're working on, if we had a number on that, which is, and we can't put a number on it has a dollar or a gold, the number has to be a quality of life number, where if you put in, let's say, for argument's sake, 20 hours of labor doing anything, you automatically, as a human being, gets education, primarily education, food, which is clean air, clean water, and clean calories. And then you're also going to have basic shelter. And you can work as long as you want if you want to go play the purple seed or something or other. But if we can fix that monetary system and change the economic system so it actually works, mountaintop removal would be gone. Most of the wars would be gone. It's absolutely, to me, this is the most frustrating thing to hear both sides, the right and left, start screaming about each other. And by the way, they're both right in certain aspects. But the reality is it's not the humanity doesn't want any of this crap. They want us to go forward and have a good quality of life. So that's what the measurement has to be. And Locke alluded to that. But then, and then when you had Smith come in and said that the invisible hand of the market or the invisible hand of God was going to, it'll dictate the game. That was the end of it. From there on in, it was all downhill.
Yeah, I understand what you mean because Smith's argument was that people's needs were defined by natural or impersonal forces, and therefore they had no role at all in defining their own needs or their own wants or anything else. It's a very dehumanizing reality, it seems to me.
No, I concur with you. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I listened to Bob Kincaid the other night, and he said, "Well, that's the problem. You do such a good job explaining things. I don't think I called in. I said I don't want to really interrupt him because I'm really listening to what he's saying. But we need to get your work out in a broader sense than it's going out now. I want to thank you very much for your work, and I know how hard it is. I know what I do every year, every day for this year's worth of work, and we don't get paid for it. We don't get, and that's the way it should be. We get satisfaction out of it, but we need to get you some more satisfaction. And thanks again for your work.
John, thank you so much. You don't know how much I appreciate hearing from you, and I appreciate you saying that, obviously, but hearing from you and listening to the input that you gave is just incredible because I think it adds tremendously. And when you talk about interrupting, again, you are not interrupting because it's a train of thought, but on the other hand, it's a long train. And what I mean is I can always figure out a way to get back into the tracks. As I get older, that gets a little bit more difficult. There'll come a time when once I go off the tracks, I can't get back on again. But when that happens, I won't be on here anyway. So, John, thank you. I appreciate so much hearing from you. And I encourage other people, too, to give us a call as well. Again, it's area code 304-658-3333. And
hey, thank you so much. Have a good one. Bye now.
Yes. Thank you, John. I can't comment enough on how much I appreciate that call. And Bob, thank you for putting that one through. And you know, that's actually the first call we've had, and wow, it was kind of. It wasn't very painful, was it? You know, I mean, try. Yeah, I want the rest of you to do it as well. And very honestly, the substance of what John was talking about is very, very real and very, very important. And he's right. You know that what we're dealing with, it seems to me, is a world, a situation in which the loudest people, not necessarily the brightest people, but the people who can scream the loudest, have kind of assumed leadership positions in either or side of this debate, and each side is defining what is best for not only their own side but for the other side as well. And as John pointed out, when you get right down to it, if you eliminate them, you get right down to where the people are. All the people want to do is make it. They just want to make it comfortably, and they want to be able to say at the end of their lives that not only are they a little bit better off than they were at the beginning, but so are their kids, and so will be their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. That's the American dream. That's what people are after. That's why people come here. And maybe in the course of our debate between these different ideological positions, we're obliterating, we're blurring the whole reason as to what we're about. You know, it's kind of interesting because in a freshman history course within the last couple of weeks, we were getting towards our final examinations, and I was making the point. One of the students made the point was talking about heaven and hell, and I just threw out the point that there are people that I've heard make the case that heaven and hell are both right here. And that ultimately, heaven defines a situation in which people are approaching the challenges and the problems and the opportunities that confront us every day in positive ways and are making positive things happen as a result of what's available. They're downplaying the challenges and the negatives, and they're taking advantage of the opportunities. And hell is when those in control are focusing on the negatives rather than the positives. And ultimately, maybe from what John said, maybe the real point of all of this is when finally we put aside our ideological differences long enough to listen to what the people we supposedly represent really want and really are about. Maybe we need to go back to the drawing board, to the well, as it were, and ask the people once again. Now, again, what is it that we really are about, that we really want in this society? And let's kind of redefine our position. For purposes of discussion, let's obliterate the right and the left and conservatives and liberals and all of that. And let's just basically go back and make sure that we all understand very carefully what it is that our people want, that our society wants. And maybe that would set us off on a totally different course than the one we've been on now, because we sure seem to be messing this one up for a lot of people in very, very, in very, very negative cases. I was just as an example of what John was talking about money and value and all the rest of it. I've been reading the story. It's in all the media today about the movie, the wife of Brad Pitt, Jolie. I can't remember her first name, but anyway, and the fact that she voluntarily chose to have a double mastectomy because she basically has been diagnosed to have a particular gene that makes her like 87% likely to develop breast cancer. Her mother died from it at a very young age, in her 50s. And I've been reading that, and I find it very impressive, and I read her case, and she's got an op-ed in today's New York Times in which she explains the decision, why she made it public, and what she hopes to do with it. But one of the things she mentioned was that the testing that she's gone through since early this year, since February, when this whole process started for her, she pointed out that the very test that discovered the problem cost more than $3,000. Now, how many people in the world can even do that? In other words, they don't have a chance. If they are susceptible to something like breast cancer, chances are whether they even know they're taking a gamble or not, they're betting their 13% against the 87% that's weighed against them. And the testing that would make that clear and give them an opportunity to make some choices is so out of reach for most people, more than $3,000, that they can't do it. So the question is, how do you make these things available to everybody on an equal and fair basis? How do you give everybody a shot? Because nobody would deny that certain people ought to have access to that information, and other people, if they can't afford it, shouldn't. I don't think anybody would defend that. So again, it's John's point is well taken, and again, the call is extremely appreciated. We were looking at the preamble, and I don't want to spend the whole day on the preamble by any stretch. I thought this would take 10 minutes, and of course it takes me 10 minutes to say hello, so let's not worry about that. But we were looking at the ensuring domestic tranquility, and the point that I was making is that the mention of that in the preamble goes back to the concerns about Shays' Rebellion. And I was talking about Stanley Cutler's course in constitutional history, and my point was, and that was right at the point that John called, my point was that Stanley Cutler, in the course, when I took his course, he was making assignments, research assignments for the research project for that particular class. As graduate students, we had to do a research project in the class. And basically, the thesis that he gave he assigned to one graduate student, and I remember it very well, is that if you look at the story of what's happening in America during the Confederation period, during the 1780s, and you look at the number of states, and I believe there are 6 of them, that make a decision to issue paper money, and then you look at those states and other states who pass stay laws and installment laws and various other mechanisms to try to move in and give people who are really strapped some relief by suspending taxes or postponing the due date on taxes or eliminating public debts for private debts for a period of time, or many of the other violations of contract, and we'll get to that in a moment, then it's very obvious that there were outbreaks of popular discontent in a number of different places. And so the question first is, what was there about the Massachusetts situation that caused Shays' Rebellion to happen? That's the first question. And the second question is, if the same conditions existed in other colonies and other states, there's states now, why didn't Shays' Rebellion happen in other states? Why did it only happen in Massachusetts? Why weren't there examples of many Shays' Rebellions in other places? Well, the fact is, if you do the research, there were, but nothing that received the attention and the floodlights of attention, is, if you will, as Shays. And based on that, on that particular class, and I remember it very well when Stanley Cutler was going over the research assignments that we were to pursue for the rest of the semester. One of my good friends and colleagues who was in the same seminar with Professor Jensen that I was, he took that issue very seriously because he ultimately ended up with a master's and a doctorate, a PhD, on that very question. His master's thesis was, why didn't Shays' Rebellion happen in every state? And what that required that he do is look at the internal politics and internal economic and political situations in every one of the 13 states in order to find out why Shays happened in Massachusetts and didn't happen in other places. And of course, what he found was that those states where government was more responsive to the needs of the people, with installment laws and paper money laws and stay laws and various other things, and paper money laws, those were the states that didn't experience Shays-like internal rebellions. But the states in which more conservative, creditor-oriented people controlled state legislatures, those that drew the line and dug in their heels and refused to respond to the needs of their people, those were the states, Massachusetts was one, those were the states that experienced the most trouble. And the reason Massachusetts experienced the most of anybody, Shays' Rebellion, was because Massachusetts, in its Constitution of 1780, probably had the most conservative of all 13 state constitutions written at the time of independence. And for more information, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 was principally drafted by John Adams. And John Adams was an attorney, and obviously very, very shrewd, and obviously very focused on the value and the sanctity of property, going back to Locke and John's call about Locke and the fact that creditors had a right to be paid, investors had a right to be paid, and property owners had a right to have their property protected. And the fact that they wouldn't veer from that, even in times of economic turmoil, which was the 1780s, then those were the states that experienced the biggest internal disturbances. It makes perfect sense, really. But to lay it out and let the information tell you the story, it's very, very helpful and very, very valuable. So that's the ensure domestic tranquility phrase within the preamble. The next item is provide for the common defense. And, of course, that's the idea of the military, the militia, Constitution initially, the founders were very, very concerned about and threatened by the idea of a standing army. They saw what had happened with the British and the troops in Boston and all the rest of it. We do not move beyond that until we get into the 1790s, and it's principally to clean out the Northwest Territory, to open it up for land speculation by getting rid of the Indians in the Northwest Territory, that the nation begins to move towards the concept of a standing army. And the person probably more responsible for that than anybody else is Alexander Hamilton. Not only does he push the idea of a standing army through politically through Congress in the early 1790s, but in the late 1790s, when John Adams is president, Abigail Adams, John's wife, is very, very concerned about the idea of a standing army, because Hamilton's goal is to head that army, not to see it as an army controlled by the President of the United States as commander-in-chief. Hamilton saw his role as being head of that army. And Abigail warned John repeatedly that this man had delusions of being another Caesar. And you know, we kind of know a little bit about that story. The next phrase in the preamble is one that is obviously I think one of the most significant in the preamble, and it is phrased to promote the general welfare. Because, of course, the debate is who decides what the general welfare is, who defines it. And, of course, the reality is those people with power to define it define it. The general welfare is what the people with the power to define it say it is. So, in a sense, you have people in positions of influence and power who can make these kinds of determinations. What they see their challenge is to have government do what they feel it needs to do and rationalize it by putting it in the context of the general welfare. And that becomes the selling point. That becomes the rationalization or the justification. So in other words, government's actions may not be in response to a clear definition of the general welfare. Rather, government's actions may be in response to the self-interests of the people in positions to make these decisions. And the idea of the general general welfare may be the result of their efforts to rationalize it or to justify it. And I think depending on each particular situation, we have to look for that. And of course, finally, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And that's the whole idea of individual freedom, which, as we know, Madison placed a priority on in Federalist Number 10 and the rest of it, when he said ultimately to tamper with people's freedom, people's liberty, is a cure for the violence of factions, a cure for the disease worse than the disease itself. And that's the preamble. So very quickly, we're at 10 minutes before the top of the hour, so let's just kind of use that 10 minutes and walk through the Constitution a little bit. So that's the preamble. That's the opening paragraph of the Constitution. The second, Article 1 of the Constitution, once you get beyond the preamble, Article 1 is devoted principally to the legislative branch of government, to Congress. Everything that relates to the makeup and the structure and the power of Congress, if it relates to Congress or Congress's powers, it's to be found in Article 1 of the Constitution somewhere. So this first section, Article 1, Section 1, basically says that all legislative powers in the Constitution shall consist shall be in the Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. And then Section 2 goes into the House of Representatives. How many members, how long they sit for, what the minimum requirements for running for office are. And then the Article 2 gets into the specific nature of the relationship between the House of Representatives and the Senate. Section 3 of Article 1 deals with the Senate, its makeup, its structure, what its particular principal priorities and duties are. It is very, very important to note that Article 1 on the legislative branch is the longest article in the Constitution. That makes perfect sense. The assumption at the time was that most of the action is going to come out of the legislative branch, not out of the House, not out of the presidency, not out of the executive branch, not out of the courts. But most people believe that the purpose of the Constitution was to fix the problems of the Confederation. And the problems of the Confederation were primarily attributable to, according to Madison, the fact that the legislatures were passing laws that were violating people's liberty and freedoms, and the sanctity of contracts and all the rest of it. So it stands to reason that the legislative branch would get the most attention and the most words in the Constitution in Article 1 because it was considered to be the source of action and potentially the source of most problems if there were going to be any. The Senate, on the other hand, is seen by many to be kind of a check on the dangers of a runaway lower house. So while there are specific requirements and duties of the Senate, they aren't nearly as extensive as those related to the House. Section 4 talks about the times, places, and manner of holding elections, when elections will be held, how long they'll serve for, and various other things. Section 5 talks about which powers each house controls internally. In other words, each house shall be the judge of its elections, its returns, the qualifications for its own members, penalizing its own members, etc. Each house shall make its own rules of procedure. Each house will keep a journal of its proceedings. Neither house, without the consent of the other one, can adjourn for more than 3 days. That, in other words, these two houses function jointly. You can't have one without the other. And as we know, in order to pass a law, it has to be approved by majorities in both houses. Section 6 talks about compensation and the extent to which elected representatives and senators are responsible to their to the people who elect them, rather than to the government, the national government in which they sit. Section 7 specifies very clearly all bills raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose amendments on all other, as on they can on all other bills. So what that means is money bills, the budget, begins in the House of Representatives. And then it lays out exactly how a bill becomes a law, and every kid in the world has had to memorize that. Then beginning in Section 8, it begins to lay out what powers the Congress will have. It'll have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, excises, this is Section 8, and to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. It'll have the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. It'll have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. It'll have the power to establish uniform rules for naturalization of new citizens, uniform rules on bankruptcies. It'll have the power to coin money, regulate. In other words, nobody but Congress can print money. That takes away the power that legislatures had during the Confederation. The national legislature will have power to coin money, regulate its value. It'll have the power to punish counterfeiters. It'll have the power to establish post offices and post roads, to promote the sciences and the arts, to set up minor courts to the Supreme Court. If additional courts, federal courts, are to be created, they are set up in Congress. To define and punish piracies, to declare war, to raise and support armies, provide for a navy, etc., etc., etc. This is Section 8 of Article 1. And then the key is at the very end of that section. Congress will have the power, and this is the last section, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So not only will Congress have all the specified powers granted to it in the Constitution, but it will have whatever power it needs in order to carry out the other powers. This is the very famous Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1, Section 8. Section 9 talks about the rights of individual citizens who move from one state to another and whether they carry their citizenship with them. It addresses issues like no title of nobility will exist in the United States. Section 10 talks about the behavior and the relation of the states and the federal government, limits on the states. No state can enter into a treaty, alliance, or confederation. No state can issue letters of marque or reprisal. No state can coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver legal tender, can pass a bill of attainder, an ex post facto law, or any law impairing the obligation of contracts. So the Constitution of the United States in Article 1, Section 10, that's where the very famous contract clause is. No state has the power to infringe on the obligations of contracts. No state can lay duties or imposts without the approval of Congress. No state can keep troops or ships of war in time of peace except by the consent of Congress. So in a sense, there is a very, very specific attention given to the powers of Congress in Article 1. Article 2 is going to deal with the power of the presidency, how he's elected, what his specific duties will be, etc. Article 3 will relate to the court, to the Supreme Court, to the judicial power of the United States. It seems to me important to mention, and we'll stop here and take our break. It seems to me important to mention that if you look at Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3, they get progressively shorter. And that, to me, says that at the time the Constitution was drafted, the founders believed that the most important of the three branches would be the legislative branch. The second most important would be the presidential, the executive branch. And there was a lot of concern about controlling that, because fear is if it ever became the most important branch, then the whole concept of Republican government that the Constitution was designed to create would be gone. So Republican government, by definition, almost mandates that the legislative branch be dominant over the executive branch. The judicial branch was considered to be the least important of all. John Marshall is going to do a lot to change that. But the judicial branch was considered to be the least important. And it's very interesting that at the very beginning, John Jay, for example, was appointed by Washington as first Chief Justice. And he stayed there for a while. But very honestly, he later went into state of New York work. He felt like there had to be something more important than what he was doing as Chief Justice. So really, it takes the third Chief Justice of the United States, John Marshall, to change that. When Jay resigns, Oliver Wolcott becomes Chief Justice. He's Chief Justice in the late 90s. And then Marshall is appointed Chief Justice at the very end of the Adams administration by John Adams, because he's a Federalist. And he believes in a strong central government. And so basically, John Adams makes sure that when Jefferson comes into power in 1801, he inherits John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And with that, let's pause and take 3 or 4 minute break. And it's 2 minutes after the hour. We'll break for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and continue today's program. Please stay with us. Back with you after our break, and welcome to those of you who are just joining us. If you've been with us since the beginning of the program, I want to thank you for staying with us. And again, I never for a moment let the realization get too far away that at any time you can, as they used to say, change the channel or turn it off or do something else or go somewhere else or whatever. So I realize that. And I appreciate if you stayed with us through this first hour. I appreciate that. If you did, you were privy to our first caller in our series, and I really appreciate hearing from John in New York. Our phone number, for those of you who are inclined to call, and I do encourage you to do that, area code 304-658-3333, 3333. And my personal email address, if you'd like to email me directly, and I promise to give you an answer, waobrien906 at gmail.com. That's O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, waobrien906 at gmail.com. And we're probably engaged in an exercise that many of you listening might find a little bit old hat. You might already be familiar with this, and there's probably things that you would say about these particular elements of the Constitution to be a little bit more significant than or informative than what I'm saying. But it just dawned on me that, while many people are asked to read the Constitution, few do. And of course, I can't say that without thinking of our deceased senator from West Virginia, Robert C. Byrd, who, of course, was very famous for carrying a copy of the Constitution in his vest pocket. And I think the fact is that the Constitution is one of those things that people are supposed to read and know they should read and pretend would never tell anybody that they didn't read, but the fact of the matter is they probably haven't. So it's kind of with that thought that I would address this. And to be honest with you, one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because I wanted to flag the particular elements of the Constitution which are going to attract the most attention from the courts. And already in our first hour, just walking through the first 3 articles of the Constitution, the first 3 being legislative, the executive branch and the judicial branch. And the point I wanted to make is that each one of these is a little bit less lengthy than the previous ones. And that speaks, and again, this gets into the issue of context, and I've mentioned this many times, and I don't think I can emphasize it enough, that context is so important because it's usually the context within which something is drafted, written, spoken, painted, portrayed, or whatever. It's usually the context that gives meaning to the particular activity itself. In other words, in order to understand the real meaning of a particular piece of literature or painting or poem or narrative or piece of fiction or piece of legislation or whatever, it's important to understand the nature of the context within which that particular item surfaced, appeared. One of the things that, I'm not an attorney, but one of the things that I find students always wrestle with and have to be made aware of is that the law is never neutral. There are people who believe that there's something absolute about right and wrong, about justice. Now, I'm not arguing philosophically here about whether there are absolutes or whether we're imprisoned by a world in which everything seems to have become relative or whatever. I don't want to get into that debate at this point. But what I would say is that law, by definition, laws are not neutral. And what I mean is they are always written and passed by groups of people in order to accomplish particular things. I have heard, and I find this very helpful, the definition of law as being what the people with the power to do so enact in order to control the people that don't have that power, for fear that they'll get it. But the fact of the matter, every law is written by somebody with a purpose. And the other thing is, it's written in a way which is going to affect people. So it's written by people to affect people. And it's very important to understand that kind of background, that kind of intent, because law, just in black and white, doesn't reveal all of its secrets. It doesn't reveal its intent. Sometimes it does. If you read between the lines, if you're very, very sharp and very cognitive and can read very critically, sometimes you can guess pretty well as to what kind of people wrote this law and what it was intended to do. And oftentimes you can do that by the impact that it's going to have on other people. You look at who it's going to impact the most, and then you begin to look at the nature of the structure of society in terms of which groups of people would have the most to gain by impacting that other group, and which group of people potentially might have the most to lose if they didn't. And you begin to ask those kinds of questions, and you can begin to get into the intent of legislation. But the one thing you can be sure of is that it is never neutral. It is always designed by some people to affect other people. And usually that effect is to control the behavior of. A lot of people have problems with this, and I think part of it is because of our jury system and this belief that if you take, 12 jurors, if you take 12 people who have not prejudged the case and you put them into the room and you let them hear the best arguments on either side. That's why it's important that everybody be guaranteed an attorney, that everybody accused of a crime be assigned an attorney, because the argument is the only way that justice is going to be reached is if those who have not prejudged the case, jurors, have access to the best defense, the best prosecution argument, and the best defense argument. And the assumption is if you take 12 neutral people and put them in a room and expose them to the best arguments on either side, and then you stir all that up, the result is going to be the truth. That, I would suggest to you, is the basis of faith in our whole legal system, is the basic assumption that truth will surface in the competition of competing ideas, or competing positions, or competing definitions of truth. That's the whole point about the idea of free speech and freedom of the press and all the rest of it, is to make the so-called market of ideas work. The assumption is if there's an open market and nobody's censored, censorship's very, very bad in this. You got to limit, you got to control censorship. Because in theory, every idea has a right to entry into the market of ideas, into the marketplace of ideas. And it's the competition and the pros and cons and the questions asked that eventually are going to allow the best positions to survive, and the weakest ones will drop by the wayside. And the assumption is that's the way you get your best ideas, that's the way you get your best answers, your most insightful directions or strategies or programs or policies or anything else. It's based on a lot of assumptions. And that, I think that's very, very important. Let's go back to the Constitution very quickly and touch on a couple of other things. One of the items we already touched on was the very famous contract clause, which is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which basically makes it illegal Section 8 at the very end is the very famous necessary and proper clause, that Congress will have all the express powers, and then it will have implied powers. You remember that term from your government classes. And the reason those powers are implied is because while they aren't there in black and white in the Constitution, they are part of the necessary and proper assignment of powers to Congress. Congress will not only have its assigned powers, but Congress will have all power necessary and proper to carry out its other powers. That's Section 8 of Article 1. The contract clause is in Section 10. When the first article on legislation on the legislative branch addresses limitations on the states and is really defining the power of the federal government, no state will enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, print money, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver legal tender, pass a bill of attainder law, an ex post facto law, or a law impairing the obligation of contracts. Ex post facto is passing a law that affects people when what you just passed wasn't the law. In other words, you pass the law after the fact. You pass a law to make something illegal after it's already happened. You can't do that. And so those are Articles 1, 2, and 3 on the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Article 4 of the Constitution deals with the relationships of the federal government and the states. This is the one that really addresses an awful lot of what we refer to as federalism, as the federal system, the allocation of the distribution of power and authority between the federal government and the state governments. And it talks specifically about, in Section 1 of Article 4, about the full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of the other states. So if you are found guilty in one state, it applies to the other states as well. It also says that citizens of each state shall have all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the other states, in all the states. Then it deals with the issue of treason. And then in Article 4, Section 3, Congress shall have power to dispose of, I particularly find this extremely interesting. Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. Nothing in this Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular state. This gives Congress the power over the territories. And we know that the issue of slavery in the territories was a very important one prior to the Civil War. And Lincoln's position was that we would not interfere with slavery where it existed because it would be a violation of property. But Congress's power to control the territories meant that Congress had the power to deny slavery the opportunity to expand into the territories, into potentially new states. In other words, it wasn't going to expand any further than it already was. Section 4 of Article 4, these are relatively minor. They aren't talked too much, but this is one that I am particularly interested in for reasons that I mentioned before, and I'll just mention it briefly again. Article 4, Section 4, says that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion. In other words, the military power of the United States shall be superior, and the states can depend on it in order to put down insurrections. But also, the federal government will guarantee a republican form of government to each state. Sometimes it's referred to as the Guarantee Clause of the Constitution, Article 4, Section 4. The reason that I got interested in this is because I was doing, and this was last fall, because I was teaching a graduate class on constitutional history, I got very interested in the idea of republican government because I get very interested in republicanism itself, and we've talked about that in terms of the small republic versus the large republic. And of course, I've made the point, and I still adhere to that same point, that the Constitution of the United States changed the nature of republican government dramatically over what it was under the Confederation. Because under the Confederation, the ideal was to locate power at the local level, at the state level, because only then could republicanism work, because only then could people's elected officials know their needs and wants well enough to accurately and adequately represent them. And Madison and James Wilson and some of the other Federalists, in promoting the Constitution, argued that you could have a large republic with a multiplicity of competing interests and factions. And in looking at Federalist 10, we talked about the impact of that, which was the surrender of power from the local level to the state level as a result of this. And then the question is, in surrendering that power, have you done damage to the whole concept of republican government? And the Federalists, the defenders of the Constitution, argued vociferously that that was not true. The Anti-Federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, tried to use that and say that the Constitution would destroy all chance of republicanism, of republican government in America, because by having power located that far away from the people, you made it impossible to accurately represent the will of the people. And that meant that the decision-making power shifted from the people to the government over the people. And my question was, does that affect republicanism enough that you could actually make the point that maybe Republican government as a concept was gone, was effectively negated by that particular change? This came up in the courts. In the case of Luther versus Borden, it was based on a political revolution, effectively, in the state of Rhode Island in the 1840s. And the question that came before the Supreme Court was, what exactly does Article 4, Section 4 mean when it guarantees to every state a Republican form of government? What exactly does that mean? What is a Republican form of government? What is republicanism? And because you had competing groups within Rhode Island that wanted to be identified as the legitimate government of Rhode Island, then the Supreme Court was put in the position of having to decide which was most consistent with the concept of republicanism, which government, which particular government in the state of Rhode Island. And the Supreme Court, in the case of Luther versus Borden, effectively kicked that can down the road, if you will. It dodged the issue. It refused to define the ingredients of Republican government. It basically said that republicanism is not judiciable. What that means is it's not up for the courts to decide what constitutes Republican government. It's up to the legislature. It's up to the people's branch to decide. So in a sense, what the court was saying is, whatever Congress decides is republicanism, that's republicanism. I found that particular decision to be incredibly significant, because basically the court was asked to rule literally on the ratification of the Constitution and the impact that it has on Republican government, and it denied the opportunity to rule on it. It basically threw the ball back into Congress's court in Luther versus Borden. And I think that's a particularly important part of the Constitution. Article 5 is the Amendment Clause. If you read Article 5, it's a paragraph about the two ways to amend the Constitution. Article 6 deals with the obligations of the Constitution vis-a-vis the states. In other words, the requirements the states have to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And Article 6 contains the very famous Supreme Law of the Land Clause. This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. So whenever there is a decision to be made about whether a state law or a federal law takes precedence, the federal law, according to the Constitution, Article 6, always must take precedence. And that is Article 6 of the Constitution. And after that, the Constitution effectively, lost my page here, if you'll hang in with me for 1 minute. After Article 6, Article 7 defines the ratification process. Ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states so ratifying the same. And then it concludes, done in convention with the unanimous consent of the states present on the 17th day of September in the year of our Lord 1787, and then it's signed by those delegates who were still there. You will notice that the Bill of Rights, there's no Bill of Rights. There are rights to jury trial and the rest of it within the judicial article, Article 3. But basically, there's nothing in the Constitution of the United States that talks about inalienable rights or God-given rights or a creator or the fact that we are, that America is a chosen nation or a nation with a special mission or that we are exceptional in any way. There's no mention of that. There's no mention of inalienable rights. There's no mention of God in the Constitution of the United States. And there is no specific Bill of Rights included. There was a Bill of Rights included in many of the state constitutions, but it was not included in the federal Constitution until the first 10 amendments. The Bill of Rights are approved, but that doesn't come until 1791, until 3 years after the Constitution is ratified. So again, you have very specific aspects of the Constitution that get a lot of attention. The Supreme Law of the Land Clause, the Contract Clause, the Commerce Clause. These get very, very serious attention from the courts. The Necessary and Proper Clause. And part of the reason is because these are vital elements, vital aspects of the Constitution. These are places within the Constitution where the courts are going to zero in. These are the places of the Constitution which are not specific but are intentionally vague. And I wanted to take a moment to say this because I think it's very important. These guys are attorneys. They are word masters. There is not one word in the Constitution of the United States that is there by accident or that is there because and people don't know what it means. Anything that wasn't very clear to these people was taken out. They know exactly what was in there. And the point that I would make is there are certain aspects of the Constitution that are vague, and I have to believe that that means they were intentionally vague, not accidentally vague. I don't think the founders inadvertently didn't define specifically what they wanted to say. I don't think it's inadvertent at all that when the Bill of Rights is being debated and approved, the elimination of the word expressly from the 10th Amendment, which specifies the powers of the states in relation to the federal government, the elimination of the word expressly totally changes the meaning of the 10th Amendment, especially when you combine it with things like the Necessary and Proper Clause, the Contract Clause, the Commerce Clause, the Guarantee Clause, the Supreme Law of the Land Clause. These are all opportunities for interpretation. They all provide places within the Constitution where the courts can come back later and either define clearly what the particular law is or choose to leave it open to interpretation and leave it vague. And I would suggest this is the basis of what those people today who believe the Constitution is and ought to be and was intended to be a living Constitution. This is where they ultimately get their support. Because it is in these vague places within the Constitution that the power to create additional meaning, the power to enhance powers resides. John Marshall is going to live off of the Contract Clause, the Commerce Clause, Supreme Law of the Land Clause, and some of these others. His goal is to strengthen the power of the central government as much as possible. And so therefore the cases that he focuses on, the cases that the court chooses to take during his reign as Chief Justice, are cases that the court wants to take because they provided an opportunity to expand the powers of the federal government, as well as expanding the influence of the court in interpreting the meaning of the Constitution. Time for a sip of coffee there. So, I really believe that this is very, very significant. If you'll pardon me for 1 second, I'm going to get an article. I don't have it right handy. Thank you. This just occurred to me. In April, the beginning of April, actually the 4th of April of this year, there was an op-ed piece in the New York Times based on the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. And it was written by Zachary Elkins, an associate professor of government, University of Texas at Austin. And basically, his argument was that the controversy over the Second Amendment has become so heated and the issue is so drawn in our society today that it seems to him that what the situation calls for is a rewrite of the Second Amendment. That what we have to do is find a way, a middle position between the extreme NRA position on the one hand and the extreme rights of citizens to be protected from those who misuse guns on the other. And basically what he's talking about is the way to solve this is to find a middle position. In other words, make the gun advocates feel more secure by guaranteeing them in a new version of the Second Amendment the right to bear arms. But make those who are arguing on the other side comfortable by writing into the Second Amendment qualifications on that right to bear arms. It doesn't include assault weapons. It's going to require background checks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, his position is if we basically approved a revision of the Second Amendment which took into consideration the concerns of both sides and rewrote the amendment in such a way that both sides could walk away feeling that they had won something, we might be able to resolve a major controversy in our society. And that is his position on the Second Amendment. That's something that I wish you would take a moment and think about. Think about it in terms of the founders. Did the founders know what they were doing when they wrote the Second Amendment? The implication here is that they didn't. Is that people would so misinterpret the Second Amendment that it would have the potential of tearing society apart. Do you think the founders knew that and dodged it? Or do you think maybe they didn't recognize it at all? Or do you think the right to bear arms wasn't an issue at all? It seems to me, at the time that we're talking about, which is late 18th century, the issue at hand, the real issue that concerned people, was the fear of a standing army and the idea that the military always had to be under the control of the civilian segment of the population. It could never be independent. It should never be seen as the toy of the executive branch. That, throughout history, is what kings were able to do, is use armies to start wars. And so in a sense, the part of the Second Amendment that most concerned the founders was the militia part, not the right to bear arms part. And I want to quote a paragraph from this article by Zachary Elkins, because I think it's significant. And he says, before you mock the idea of a constitutional amendment, consider that hardly anyone is happy with our unstable status quo. Gun enthusiasts fear their rights are under constant threat. Gun control advocates point to the danger of illegal guns and easy access to firearms. So literally, it's torn our society apart. And his proposal of a revision of the Second Amendment is an effort to bring those two sides back together again by redrafting the Second Amendment in such a way that it gives each side something. And this next paragraph I find particularly interesting. This is research that he's done. And I think it says a lot. It is usually quite unusual for gun rights to be included in any constitution. In our historical study of constitutions, my colleagues and I identified only 15 constitutions in 9 countries that had ever included an explicit right to bear arms. Almost all of these constitutions have been in Latin America, and most were from the 19th century. Only 3 countries, Guatemala, Mexico, and the United States, have a constitutional right to arms. Of the 15, ours is the only one that does not explicitly include a restrictive condition. We have the only constitution that mentions the right to bear arms without limitations. Of course, many Americans and a minority of the Supreme Court believe that our militia clause amounts to such a restriction, an interpretation that the court rejected in 2008 when it ruled that the Second Amendment protected the individual's right to bear arms. I find it very interesting that while we have so much debate and there's so much heat generated in our society today on the Second Amendment and on the NRA and all the rest of it, we are the only constitution in the modern period that includes a right to bear arms without any limitations on it, unless you consider the militia clause the limitation. And I really think that this is very significant, because it was the militia clause that received most of the attention when the Bill of Rights was written, not the right to bear arms clause. In the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, written in 1789, 2 years before our Bill of Rights, there's no mention of the right to bear arms at all. But there is mention of the people's right to control the militia, and in fact that it exists for the protection of the public, not individuals within the public. So, in a sense, this whole emphasis on right to bear arms might be something that's unique to us. I would suggest that it is. I would suggest that if you go back, it's not until nobody mentions the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment, through the 18th century, the 19th century, and most of the 20th century. It's not until 1980s, when Ronald Reagan is in the White House, that the issue of the right to bear arms as a citizen right in this society becomes an issue. And a conscious movement developed, and I mentioned this the other day, a conscious movement developed primarily within conservative, right-wing leaning organizations like the Heritage Foundation and the rest, to begin to develop a constitutional foundation for a Supreme Court decision that would for once and all affirm the citizen's right to bear arms in the Second Amendment. And it came in 2008 with the Washington, D.C. court decision to strike down its gun control laws. The right to bear arms in our Second Amendment is an issue that gained legs not until the 1980s, when it became a political issue. Had nothing to do with the rights of citizens or anything else. This is all something that has happened within the last 33 years. And given that, do you want to go along with the author of this article and rewrite the Constitution, rewrite the Second Amendment in such a way that it affirms the right to bear arms? Maybe the rewrite ought to eliminate that clause from the Second Amendment and just leave the one about the right of the people to control the militia. That would be a revision of the Second Amendment. I would suggest to you that if we take this proposal to rewrite the Second Amendment in such a way that we resolve the controversy in our society, we would be creating a right as part of our Constitution that the founders didn't believe necessarily needed to be there independently of the public control of the militia clause. It seems to me we have to basically understand where the priorities were within the context within which it was written. If we do this, if we were to rewrite the Second Amendment and build in the right to bear arms with some limitations as a new Second Amendment, then that would be an affirmation of the whole idea of a living Constitution, would it not? That would violate the position of all the people arguing for the right to bear arms. What they want is not only the right to bear arms, but they want the nation to believe that it was the intent of the founders to put it in the Constitution initially. They don't want it to be the result of a contemporary debate in society, an effort to negotiate between two extreme positions. They want it to be something that the founders intended the people to have independently of public control over the militias. And the question is that something we want to give them? I would suggest to you that we might be better off leaving it the way it is, because at some point in time, this too shall pass. And there'll be a different court with different issues as their priority agendas. And at that point, the Washington, D.C. 2008 decision conceivably could be ripe for overturning. It seems to me that if, given the nature of society today with these extremist groups and right-wing groups and all the rest of it, the last thing that we want to do is put into the Constitution of the United States a revised Second Amendment, which in bold highlights the right of individuals to bear arms in our society, given the issues, given the fact that 90% of the people, according to opinion polls, want some sort of restrictions and some sort of limitations. They don't want the right to bear arms taken away. Nobody's arguing for that. But I would suggest to you that most drafters of constitutions took that so much for granted that they didn't even include it in their constitutions. It's in ours. And it took until the 1980s for people to begin to make hay with it. So it's very interesting if those who oppose the idea of a living Constitution prevail in this, it's going to be because of the living Constitution, not because they scream the loudest that the founders intended it. Because the fact of the matter is, that's a very, very difficult one to prove. We're at almost 10 minutes of the hour, 48 minutes after the hour, and we've got about maybe 8 minutes or left or so, and in our program today. And I wanted to get to some Supreme Court decisions. I think we've pretty well set up the groundwork for this in tomorrow's program. Because what we're going to do is look at some Supreme Court cases that addressed very specifically the Contract Clause, the Commerce Clause, and the rest of them. And the important thing is the background of these cases. Because, again, the context is everything, it seems to me. And so when you put it in context and you look at what the issues are, the decision of the court becomes very, very, very important and very specific and very understandable. But again, it seems to me that the real issue of Supreme Court decisions is that when you read the decisions, the justices are making them within the context, within the definition of issues as they currently exist. So in a sense, the more deliberate the courts are in its decision making, the more emphasis they are putting on the validity and the vitality of the need for a living constitution. Because if you go all the way back and suggest that if you can't prove that the founders wanted it, then the power is not there, then the right is not there, then it seemed to me you would deny the federal Constitution the opportunity to adjust to changing times. And if our Constitution hadn't been drafted in a way which made it possible for it to adjust to changing times, then I suggest to you that the Constitution as we know it would no longer be in effect anyway. So, and I'm making an interpretive position argument here, I realize, but I believe it very, very firmly. I believe that the founders were too sharp, they were too shrewd, they were word masters, they knew exactly what they were putting into the Constitution and what they were leaving out. Madison's position, I'm using this as an example, Madison's position against the need for a Bill of Rights, for example, is based on his argument that once you start specifying what specific rights people have, what happens if you overlook one, or you eliminate one, or you inadvertently leave one out? You're getting yourself into a real mess, Madison believed, when you allow your Constitution to become so specific that there's no room for interpretation at all. What allows a Constitution to live, to work, is because it can be adapted to changing circumstances and kept relevant, kept up to date, kept meaningful. And that's been the strength of our Constitution, as evidenced by the relatively few number of amendments to it. Look at state constitutions. I don't care which state you look at. Just look at state constitutions and the number of amendments to those constitutions. And this is one of the issues that Madison raised in his Vices of the American Political System in 1787. The states were passing rules, and then they were coming up with passing laws, and then they were passing laws negating the previous laws and changing them with new laws. And the sum total is that there were so many laws in the books that nobody realistically could know what the law was. And so Madison's argument is you can't do that. What you need to do is you need to have a Constitution which is short enough and manageable enough that the people who ratify it, the people who live within it, can understand it. Now, again, we've debated, in fact, whether he really meant that or not. But I think what he's thinking about here are those people that interpret and define the meanings of the Constitution in specific cases, in specific instances. And I believe that's very, very valid. We are at 53 minutes after the hour, and we've got about we've got about 3 minutes left in today's program. And I don't want to get into anything new today. So what I'd like to do is kind of sum up a little bit, and more important, sum up today's program by thanking John for his call and inviting others of you out there to make a call and to join us. Give us all the benefit of your thinking. If you're listening to this program, if you are a listener to the Horn, you have ideas, you have suggestions, you have concerns, you have depth. You do not think superficially. By definition, you wouldn't be here if that was true. And so the pact is, all of us can benefit from hearing from you, and I would like to hear from you in future programs. I want you to feel comfortable doing it. Please don't feel that you'll be interrupting me. The reason I'm going on as I am, because you're not there. If you're there, I'm not going to have the opportunity to go off into these wild blue yonder flights of fantasy that I periodically take, and sometimes I have to kind of pinch myself in order to get myself back to reality, or back to earth, so to speak. But again, we would love to hear from you, and I want to thank John for breaking the ice and being our first caller today. In today's program, what we addressed were the parts, the elements, or the different articles of the Constitution of the United States. And again, it seems to me if you understand the basic structure, then you kind of know where within the Constitution to look for specific things. If a particular issue comes up, then once you understand the structure of the Constitution, you have a much better idea as to where something on that might be. If you're not as knowledgeable or as conscious of the Constitution and its details as many people believe they ought to be, but most people aren't, and I include myself there. So again, we have to look at the period in which it was written. The longest article, the branch of government that got the most attention, is the legislative branch. It makes perfect sense. That was the branch that was all-powerful during the Confederation period. That was the branch that was the origin of Madison's vices of the political system. Since that was the branch that controlled all the decision-making, that was the branch that needed the reforms. So it stands to reason that the bulk of the Constitution's attention would be on defining more clearly and limiting the opportunities and what Madison and the founders believed. What Madison and the founders believed were the failings of that particular branch. So naturally, Article 1 would be the longest article. It stands to reason. Article 2 on the powers of the president. If you read the constitutional debates, they didn't spend as much time on the office of the presidency as they did on the legislature. But the debates were heated, and the debates were real, and the concerns were real. Most people believed that if you control the legislature, the greatest threat to freedom is going to come from the executive branch. And so therefore the question is how you choose the president, how you limit the president, how you build the president checks and balances on the power of the president into the whole separation of powers and checks and balances system. And that becomes Article 2. Article 3 on the Supreme Court and as many courts, subsidiary courts, as Congress chooses to make. And we saw in Article 1 the fact that Congress does indeed have the power to create subordinate federal courts to the Supreme Court. And, how the justices are made, the fact that they serve during good behavior, which means they serve for life. And they can be impeached under very specific circumstances, as can the president. We know all about that. And then we have specific attention to the powers of the relationship of power, the division of power between the states and the central government in what is called America's federal system, the system of federalism. And then we have the amendment clause, the amendment, Article 5. And Article 6 is a supreme law of the land clause, and Article 7 is ratification. And we are at 58 minutes after the hour, and I was looking for an opportunity to fill the last couple of minutes, and I almost ran over. So let me thank you for being with us today, and let me wish that you'll be back with us again tomorrow I'm Bill O'Brien. Please be safe, and thank you.